what we were going to do today and tomorrow, we're going to talk fundamentally about how we can help immigrants find jobs that make use of their experience and expertise and education. Now, I know all of you are doing this kind of work already, so I mean, you know how to do it. This is not a remedial course. It's like you're not here because you don't do it well, obviously. We're going to talk about how can we do it better. That's kind of the mindset. By better, here's what I mean. I think you've heard me mention in the videos, I'm married to a Chinese lady. Her name is Caroline. So Caroline and I did a series of workshops throughout the province of Ontario that was funded by the federal government for, counselors, program managers, job developers in immigrant servicing agencies throughout the province. So I got to go to Sault Ste. Marie, Thunder Bay, and all these places. And it was just like here, like a two-day workshop. So generally speaking, what we found through these workshops is you could kind of divide the people involved in either helping immigrants or students, foreign students. I understand some of you work with foreign students more than immigrants. Okay? The people who help immigrants and foreign students find jobs in Canada can be generally speaking divided into two categories. One category of people who have immigrated themselves to Canada and became counselors. Another category is people who grew up in Canada and who typically have a background in human resources or social work, something along those lines. And what we found is the people who came to Canada as immigrants, as adults, quite often had very limited work experience inside Canadian organizations. They've worked in the not-for-profit sector, but they've never worked in either the government or a corporation, for-profit corporation. When it came to people born and raised in Canada who had a background in social work or human resources, the challenge was for them not having gone through the immigration process, which meant that there were some elements which they may not appreciate fully. So the goal of the workshop is essentially to bring all these elements together so that people will be able to see the whole picture. And you're going to hear a lot about my own experience as a counselor. So what I mean by that is, for a period of about 5 years, I was working extensively with the city of Toronto. At the time, there were very few programs for immigrants who had a high level of formal education. So during that period of time, whenever the city of Toronto had someone who had a bachelor and many years of experience, master's or PhD, they would send me that person and I would work with them one-on-one to teach them how to find themselves a job. That was the goal of the program. And I was able to help a number of them do that. And by working with them one-on-one, I learned a number of things, like kind of some things that work, some things that don't work. And so today and tomorrow is about giving you some of that information as much as possible. I also worked on the receiving end. What I mean by that is when I worked for Xerox, I was working as an engineer at that time. And I didn't have a budget. I couldn't hire a technician, but I still wanted to have someone do some of the technical work I had to do. So I went through one of the not-for-profit agencies in the Toronto area. At the time, that one was called Center for Advancement in Work and Living, and then they changed the name to Jumpstart, and I don't know what they're called today, but the equivalent of the Center for Newcomers or like an agency like that. And at the time, there was a program from, the acronym was HRDC. The idea was the corporation didn't have to pay the salary of the person. That was paid by the federal government. All Xerox had to pay was the bus tickets for that person. So we could have someone for 8 weeks. I mean, the idea was to get their foot in the door, obviously. And on our side, the idea was we could see, we could test them out, if I can put it that way. That was kind of an extension, like an extended interview. And I had 14 people like this, one after the other. And I was able to, and the unspoken deal with the agency was, well, you send me somebody, I help them find a job. And I was able to help 9 of them find a job in their field. So I saw what happens also on the kind of the employer side. Finally, the other part of my experience that you're going to hear about extensively today and tomorrow is I've done a lot of work with accounting firms, like the public the big 4, as they call them, like PwC, Ernst & Young, Deloitte, and PricewaterhouseCoopers. So, I mean, that will be directly relevant, Javier. So, the idea is, and that started in 2004. Since then, I've had a contract with, 2 of the big 4. Every time they send someone to Canada from another country or from Canada overseas, I will work with, I and my associates will work with that person in trying to help them integrate in the workplace. So, and over the years, I think we've coached, 1,200, 1,300 people overall. And we've seen a lot of things some things that work again, and some things that don't work. So my goal is to kind of put all that together and hopefully give you some suggestions, ideas, things that you can use concretely. And you'll see this is definitely going to be very practical. It is meant to be about how do you do, first, how do you work with people one-on-one? What do they need to learn? And how do you communicate that information to them so that they integrate it in their thought process? So we don't have a big group, so we'll really encourage everybody to ask questions or make comments. Okay? Since we're recording, when you ask a question or make a comment, I will ask you to pass this thing around so that we can record it as well. So very simply, why we're here. So you all know that. So I'll use interchangeably the acronym IEP, Internationally Educated Professionals, and immigrants. Some of you may use other acronyms. I've heard FTP, like Foreign Trained Professionals. I've heard, what was that? Oh, there's plenty of acronyms, okay? Whichever one you want to use, then that's not a problem. One important thing, when I use the word immigrant, I am an immigrant. The definition of immigrant is simply somebody who lives and works in a country which is not the one where he or she was born. There is no negative connotation associated with that word. I'm just using it, straight from a descriptive perspective. The other thing that we are going to discuss extensively is the disconnects between the way immigrants look for work and the way Canadian organizations recruit. I'm sure you all know when immigrants look for work in Canada, fundamentally what they try to do is look for work the way they would have back home. And the same is true for foreign students. And as a result, the big challenge is, well, that sounds great, that would work well back home, but it doesn't work here because organizations recruit in a different way. And we're going to discuss extensively why Canadian organizations recruit the way they do. Because it is important, if you understand why, I find it helps so much people know how to change their behavior. Like if you know why, it's way easier to change your behavior. So, as I mentioned, we're going to work. I'm going to address the 2 key categories of counselors. I'll just use that word, or coaches, the generic word. Okay. So the idea is giving everybody information about kind of what happens. Like both obviously on the candidate side and on the recruiter side. So we'll look at the impact of cultural differences on immigrants and on organizations. We're also going to look at how to manage those differences during the job search process. So for the candidates, the recruitment and selection process from the organization's perspective, and looking at the impact of those differences during the counseling process. Because I'm sure you've had situations where you have a client, it's absolutely obvious to you what they should do, and that's not what they're doing. Like kind of why, and how do we manage that? So we're going to, as I said, we'll use a number of real life examples. I'll tell you what happened, because some of the people I've kind of followed over the years, so I can tell you what happened over time. Today what we're going to discuss is this. So we're pretty much done with introductions. We will talk about few key concepts. So some of that part will be going over some fundamental points that were covered in the videos, which I really want to make sure everybody kind of takes into consideration, and most importantly, I will bring them to the context of a job search. And then we're going to spend quite a bit of time talking about this fundamental point. Most immigrants who come to Canada today come from countries that are significantly more hierarchical than Canada is. Okay? And one of the fundamental points about growing up in a hierarchical culture is that you learn to think of yourself as a generalist. And that is not the way Canadians think. Canadians think like specialists. So we're going to look at fundamentally how that difference, meaning thinking of yourself as a generalist versus thinking of yourself as a specialist, what difference does it make during the job search process? And my experience is it makes a world of difference. And it is a little bit like a cultural revolution. It's really learning to think in a very different way. So we're going to look at what does it mean, generally speaking, and how that applies at every step of the job search process. So in particular, when you create a resume, good morning, have a seat, please join us. Okay. So what does it look like? What difference does it make when you create your resume? What difference does it make when you try to network? Because it makes a world of difference there again. Tomorrow, we're going to talk about what difference does it make when you are interviewing. Again, huge difference in whether you try to project the image of a specialist or project the image of a generalist. So this is more about counseling. We'll talk about making strategic decisions. By making strategic decisions, and we're going to talk about situations where people have, for example, landed in the wrong place. What I mean by that is, their skills are needed in Canada, but not where they landed. People who may need to go back to university or college before they do their job search. Maybe, maybe not. How do you help them make the decision as a counselor? We'll talk about facing reality. Okay? Like people fundamentally who have a big challenge ahead of them may not have appreciated how big of a challenge it is. I'm sure you've seen people in situations like that. We'll talk about regulatory bodies in particular around there. We'll talk about getting through probation period. For many of you, if you've done counseling, I'm sure you've had that situation. You've placed somebody you worked with found a job, and within 2 weeks they're out of that job. Okay, they quit. I mean, the worst point is they quit. Like not they were kicked out. No, they quit. It's like that one drives me up the wall. So how do we help people get through probation period? And if we have time, we'll talk about placing immigrants, like kind of the situation where you are calling or trying to find out about positions that your clients might be able to get. Okay?